Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about housing. Really what this chapter is investigating is the history of how American neighborhoods became segregated from rural, suburban, and urban areas. The key point takes away, we're going to be talking about urbanization, again the immigrants coming into the United States and African Americans moving from the south to the north, housing shortages, and increasing housing costs, along with the wage gap between social classes growing, which is disproportionately hurting minorities, ethnic, and racial. We're talking about white flight after the integration of the schools and the delegalization of segregation, and then the rise of racialized neighborhoods since the 1900s. The book describes this concept of black areas as an introduction to the beginning of the segregation. So again, you have racially segregated neighborhoods in America. But prior to the 1900s, there was no such thing as black areas, for example. You did have, ethnic neighborhoods that were historically distributed, but again, even sharecroppers lived next door to African Americans. People in the cities of all races lived on top of each other during this time prior to the 1900s. It wasn't really until the 1900s that you start to see the segregation. Non-whites and immigrants historically, though, have always been subjugated into the poorest part of town, but that's again because they have higher numbers of people in the lower class due to prejudice and discrimination that, again, economically subjugated people in the lower class based upon their race or ethnicity. During the rise of industrialization, you have a huge growth of immigrant populations and African Americans moving to the north. And again, it comes out of the idea of class conflict of the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, because during this time, only the Protestant white males had any power, and so anyone who wasn't Protestant white and male was subjugated into the lower classes. And again, you had this urban growth of minority racial and ethnic groups during the industrialization in the early 1900s. However, they often clustered into ethnic groups, and that's kind of where the rise of segregated neighborhoods come from. The racialization of neighborhoods, and the book talks about Irish, Polish, Swedish, Persian, Italian, again, comes from the influx of immigrants and African Americans coming out of the South, and then them kind of clustering together into these segregated areas. Compounded by that were the idea of white-only places, and until those groups were allowed to become white, became integrated into white society, for example, they remained segregated. During the late 1800s and the early 1900s, you start to see ethnic conflict growing between all of these groups. Europeans were able to work their way out of the slums over time as they were incorporated into what is described as the white race, even though we know in this class there's no such thing. But again, Asians and Hispanics and African Americans remained subjugated into the lower classes and were given very little opportunity to rise up the social class ladder. Again, when it comes to migration and urbanizations, as immigrants were coming to America and Native Americans were being forced off their reservations, and as African Americans came up north, you started to see great diversity in the cities. Various policies were susceptible to racism at the time, such as anti-Asian, anti-Mexican, after they were blamed for the Great Depression, like your book talks about. And again, this was associated with our immigration patterns that we've talked about in previous lectures, how depending upon the prejudice of the day, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act for anti-Asians, anti-Hispanic policies up until the 1960s, which then came back in the 1990s and the 2000s. But again, as the diversity of America increased, I always like to ask, is America really a melting pot, or is it more like oil and water because of the neighborhood segregation that resulted and the ethnic and racial segregation that resulted? And so what you see in America is, even though we have tons of diversity, little things like interracial marriage or, the diversity of neighborhoods, you still find are incredibly segregated, okay? The book talks about Native Americans being removed even further during the 1900s from their reservations and being forced to migrate to cities. In the 1950s, you had the Tribal Termination Acts. This is when the federal government turned over power of the reservations to the states. The states then went in and, with policies and procedures, took the land from Native Americans, and 1 million acres of land were given to white governments, which was then distributed to white families. Blacks moved from the south to the north to avoid sharecropping and Jim Crow, hence the rise of black neighborhoods in the cities. World War I saw a decrease in the cheap European immigrant labor and a rise in Asian and Hispanic around the 1960s. During this time, you had the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, that was coming up as a racist group intent on enforcing segregation. Then also during this time, you have the anti-racists who were against the KKK saying, again, we should all just get along. You had things called sundown towns, and these were described as, the book talks about all this, and it's really hard to talk about, one from, as a white male, because, are we involved in that, and is that our history? Because I don't, again, think of myself as a white male because I don't really want to be a part of it. But again, the idea that there were these towns and they would put up signs, and the signs that the book talks about use words that I could never use. They're so sad and inappropriate, but please read your little part about your book. But they put up a sign that says basically, if you were black, Jewish, Chinese, Native American, don't be here after dark. And it's just, again, really, really sad, okay? So origins of segregated neighborhoods, again, this kind of goes to the in-group, out-group of basic sociology, is that, do people identify with their in-group and then, interact within that group? So again, we had a housing shortage that was tougher on non-whites pre-World War II. Mostly whites only benefited from loans. So essentially, neighborhoods were owned by whites, the buildings were owned by the whites, the landlords were whites, the mortgage people were whites, and essentially they didn't give any benefits to anybody that wasn't white. And so all the non-whites were segregated into the poorest neighborhoods. And this is where America was described like a caste system, because if you were born black and poor, it was virtually impossible to get out of poverty. Okay, deeds tied into racism, and it talks about in the book that up all the way through the 1940s, the late 1948, that even in your deed, when you had a house, it said in there that if you were not allowed to sell your house to a non-white. This was overturned in the 1948, and again, we don't give a lot of credits to whites in the 1940s picking fights over racist policies, but again, it wasn't just non-whites that fought for racial equality. During the 1940s is one of the proudest times, I would say, for advocates of the law, using the law to be able to gain power. And this is around the time when the Supreme Court became friends to non-whites. Okay, but essentially slumlords were able to gain power over racial and ethnic minorities, and again, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. The bourgeoisie, the owners, were able to milk profit by giving the worst housing and not taking care of them, and then only giving loans to whites, etc., which enabled whites to gain more wealth than non-whites. Okay, so again, this oppression of non-whites has been going on for centuries, whether it's slavery or indentured servitude or being subjugated in the housing, in the economic market, the job market. Being stuck in the lower class because of your race and ethnicity was a real thing. And when you stick somebody in poverty, how does that associate with the rise of crime and violence and things along those lines? So urban development demolished minority neighborhoods in the 1960s also. So even these ethnic neighborhoods that were segregated and kind of clustered together during the growth of the cities in the 1960s, these neighborhoods were wiped out. When the schools were integrated in the 1950s and the 1960s, whites began to move to the suburbs, and then the high tax districts with the good schools became out in the suburbs, and the cities were stuck with nothing but poor whites and poor minority groups, okay? During this time, because of that, you started to see a rise in crime, and the cities became far more dangerous in the 70s, 80s, and the 90s. And so much of the social problems were blamed on people's race and ethnicity, when in fact it was really just that people that had been historically stuck in poverty that couldn't afford to move out to the nice districts during the white flight, they were the ones who had higher rates of crime and drug use, not because of their race and ethnicity, but just because of the presence of poverty. So again, you had a huge migration into the cities in the late 1800s and the 1900s of immigrants and African Americans and also Native Americans going into the 1950s. So by the 1950s, the cities were pretty diverse, but the neighborhoods themselves were very well segregated, and then the best housing was restricted for the whites, and the non-whites were forced to, be at the mercy of the slumlords and not being able to access wealth by able to get property, for example. And then when the schools were integrated, those diverse cities, then, even though they were racially neighborhoods segregated, all the people that could afford to left the cities and moved out to the suburbs, okay? And so these nice suburbs became all white, nice suburbs where the good schools and the good tax districts were. And so the only people that were left in the cities after the 1960s were people that couldn't afford to get out, poor people that were either white or non-white, okay? So urban unrest begins to grow in the 1960s. Again, this became havens for uprisings in poor racialized neighborhoods because really people that were stuck in poverty were sick of a racist system that kept them in poverty, okay? So the riots that came out and the movements that came out really were combating white supremacy. There were protests and rage toward a racist system which continues until today. It has evolved into more conventional methods, but still, you still see racial riots every 20 to 30 years. You had them in the 1919, you had them in the 1940s, you had them in the 1960s, you had them in the 1990s, you have them now in the 2010s and the 2020s. Okay, so this movement continues because oppression and discrimination still exist against non-whites, okay? Really, it's shedding light on the plight of the urban poor. And I know that the book talks about the plight of the urban black poor, but it's also the urban poor in general. The 1960s and 1940s, 50s, and 60s saw movements by Hispanics and Asian Americans and Native Americans and African Americans that has continued to this day, and women, okay? So the current state of racial integration, the city integration is increasing. However, neighborhoods, even after the white flight, everyone moved to the suburbs, but now people are moving back into the cities. However, the neighborhoods still tend to remain very segregated for whites, and for neighborhoods that are non-whites, they tend to be a little bit more integrated, but there still is a lot of segregation, like our Asians all living in Asian neighborhoods, and African Americans and whites all living in segregated neighborhoods. You find higher rates of integration in non-white neighborhoods, but still, ethnic and racial segregation still exists across the board, okay? Again, much of this is caused by economics, but also personal choice, the roots of racism. It's all about economic and social power and subjugating people into the lower classes, and the ways we did that was often based upon somebody's race and ethnicity. The book talks about examples of housing discrimination and how that still remains to this day when it comes to mortgage rate discrimination and how much they're paying for their mortgage and reasons they're denied loans, things along those lines. The book talks about intersectionality and that discrimination is intersectional because it's factors like gender, race, ethnicity, religion, sexuality all play into whether or not somebody's approved for a mortgage. Poverty affects minorities being subjugated into the lower classes to this day. Again, the book in a couple chapters ago talked about how a white person is hired 3 times more than a non-white person, and a male is hired more twice as much as a female, for example. The book coins this idea of advanced marginality, that the class disparities are increasing and the middle class is kind of going away. So those who have power, the bourgeoisie, are consolidating more power over the proletariat, the lower classes. And so the increase in subjugation for poor people and racialized and ethnic minorities continues to this day. The book does discuss interracial conflict, and this goes back to the gangs of New York all the way to the 1990s with the conflict between African Americans and Koreans that the book talks about. So interracial conflict still exists to this day. We've talked a lot about this in this class. Economics are swinging from cities currently to small towns, and then to suburbs, and then back to cities, and so you can kind of see the fluctuation of the money and where it's going. Finally, the book concludes with this idea of rural areas and how rural areas are hit hardest by the economic effects of modern times. Again, the lower class jobs are going away. The small towns lost their factories. as there's large income disparities between affluent cities and small towns. However, on a high note, the small towns are being, you can see a growth of immigrants moving into small towns and other minority groups, racial and ethnic minority groups. This is definitely on the plus side, but again, you have to ask, is that because the cities are too expensive, therefore racial and ethnic minority groups are having to move to the small towns where it's not as expensive to live, for example? Okay, thank you all so much and have a wonderful day.